The West Virginia football team's offseason roster overhaul hit another checkpoint this past weekend as the spring transfer portal window closed, meaning outside of players who have already graduated from WVU cannot transfer out of West Virginia on their own accord through the beginning of the 2025 football season. I'm Carson Fox for a loaded, jam-packed, exciting edition of Fox on West Virginia Mountaineer Sports. We have so much to talk about because you can't win seasons in the off-season, but you surely can put yourself so far behind the eight ball that contending or winning a conference championship can be, certainly in my opinion, lost during an off-season and some of the moves that are made. So let's talk about all of the caveats of what I just had to say. So again, outside of players who have already graduated, so those are players who are now in their fifth year of eligibility with a red shirt, so redshirt seniors, and there's a lot of them already on this football team. Right now, the caveats are like this roster is pretty much set for whenever the season kicks off against Robert Morris. So the caveats being, first and foremost, Judge Claudia Wilkins. If you're following the national news with the House settlement, she's the judge overseeing it, has pretty much said absolutely not to the 105-player roster limit for football. Essentially what head coach Rich Rodriguez wanted all along and would talked about during the spring season, leading up to the spring showcase. Right before the spring portal opened, he was advocating for grandfathering the roster limit in over the next 4 years. That's what it sounds like Judge Wilkins wants. So now it's up to the leaders of the NCAA and Power Conference and other powers that be to come to some sort of a agreement on what that looks like. So, going in to the spring portal season, which I'll talk about, there was much of an assumption, and something that I even talked about, that's what West Virginia was going to have to essentially cut down to, was 105 players. So depending upon what that final number is, West Virginia will have to cut down to it by this season starts. So as of Monday, April 28th, at 104 players, head coach Rich Rodriguez could keep everybody. He could cut more players during or after August camp. We could have grads transfer, and WVU has quite a few on this roster, as I mentioned, and this is very, 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 very much doubtful at this point. But we could have a player go so nuclear as potentially unenroll at West Virginia to go somewhere else, challenge it in court, and then play this upcoming fall. That is how crazy that this no-rules college football is of today. But it's needless to say, unless something absolutely nuclear like that, some fan favorites who have been, contributors over these last few seasons, Nico Marchiol, Jaheim White, Rodney Gallagher, they will be in a gold and blue uniform this upcoming fall. So let's kind of start there. And let's start at the end. So we're beginning at the end of spring practice, right before the spring showcase began, up to the portal closing as of last Friday at 11:59 p.m. Let's start by going through everyone who left the program, and I'll give you my thoughts. So again, Rodriguez had to operate under the impression going into those last 3 weeks or so, operating that 105 players would be the cut down limit. Now remember, there are a whole bunch of players who have not joined this program already coming out of the high school ranks. So I consider this as part of 3 categories, and I'm going to kind of walk through them. So the players who I honestly, this is just me, this is I guess a guy you listen to on YouTube here, guys that Rodriguez and staff felt as if he did not either want or need. Quarterback Abe Fenwick, running back LJ Turner, running back Judah Price, running back Trayvon Dunbar, and then blew up the tight end room. Tight ends Johnny Pascuzzi, Noah Bram, Jackson Marco, Jackson Acquardi. Wide receivers, 3 took a hit, Torrey Johnson Jr., Dom Collins, Brandon Raymond. Offensive lineman Justin Terry. 3 defensive linemen, Elijah Kinsler, Makai Byerson, Amir Leonard John Charles. 3 Bandit outside linebackers, Orion Fisher, Ramondo Johnson, Obina Onwuka, and then 4 safeties, Aiden Tagaloa Nelson, Chris Henry, Sammy Etienne, Nesai Bell, and 5 cornerbacks, Jacoby Spells, Keon Washington, Jordan Jackson, Mikey Preston, and Zaw Jackson. Players who left of their own accord. This was some tomfoolery I felt like that happened right at the beginning of the 2024 season. There were a couple of players that Neil Brown deemed were medically unable to compete for the season. I think there were like 2 or 3. So just kind of were out in purgatory, not on the team's roster. One of those being Zachariah Keith. So he hit the transfer portal, and now it ended up at Southern Miss, so I can't really necessarily count that as toward that. But I would say players who left of their own accord definitely was offensive lineman Gavin Crawford. His offer list was pretty stout out of high school recruiting. This fall 25 high school recruiting class is just a mess, basically whittled down to practically nothing. Gavin Crawford, one of the few big pieces left. A guy out of Good Counsel High School in Olney, Maryland. His teammate Aiden Buchanan already decommitted. He was going to be a summer starter and ended up deciding to go with North Carolina. So Gavin Crawford, not wanting to be there, now one of four offensive line commits for West Virginia, from former West Virginia players or current former West Virginia players or commits to go to Virginia Tech to join offensive line coach Matt Moore. Was that a good decision by head coach Rich Rod to let him walk and start anew with Jack Bicknell Jr.? Only can be, something that we can speculate on maybe a year from now, 2 years from now. But Kyle Altuner, Tomas Remack, Lucas Austin, Gavin Crawford, all now in a Hokie uniform. Simple as that for Gavin Crawford to try and join that squad. And then high school players who also committed elsewhere. Evan Powell ended up choosing East Carolina, a kid who was committed late. I don't know if he never signed on signing day. It was kind of out in the wilderness, then said he was coming to West Virginia and now backed on that. So Evan Powell, we hardly knew ye. Some of the guys I'll just comment real quick on that, he didn't feel as if West Virginia Rich Rodriguez. One of the few of the surprising ones to me, tight end Jack Samarco, a guy who saw time. Maybe this was one of the reasons why Blaine Stewart chose to go to Tampa Bay, just an ideological difference with head coach Rich Rodriguez. Always has those years of when he was younger and knowing Coach Rodriguez from afar, but working with him as a colleague, having a different ideological direction at the position, moving him out of the tight end coaching position to inside receivers, and now look, 2 guys that he spent blood, sweat, tears on recruiting in Jack Samarco and Jackson Aquardi are now both out. So either not in Jack Samarco, I feel like contributed more in 2024 than I was originally expecting. If you go back and watch my signing day video, he was a guy who was kind of underproductive, if you want to call it that. He went from like a decent high school, I think, as a junior, and then went to a lesser high school and performed decently, but didn't have the kind of playoff opportunities to continue on the season where he could have contributed against higher competition. So did well with what he could, but not for a really great high school program. Comes into WVU, being Cole Taylor's backup, getting those up and pretty much jumping Noah Bram, and also contributing some decent snaps behind Traylon Davis, who was tight end number 2. Davis, I thought, played admirably. So I was really thinking Jack Samarco might kind of be the number 2 blocking tight end if Jacob Barrick is going to be that number 1, and Greg Genros being used as maybe a pass-catching tight end. So I think there were brighter days ahead for Jack Samarco, and Alabama clearly believes so because they're taking him and adding him to their roster. So I was very interested by that. Talked about this in my video a couple of weeks ago about Rodney Gallagher, and that I could see the writing on the wall about Torrey Johnson Jr. when his brother who's a 4-star recruit, didn't include West Virginia in his top final 6 for his recruiting commitment. So the writing on the wall there, and he was just a tweener, just a guy probably not fast enough to play wide receiver, too big, but not big enough to play tight end. When you're 6'3", 220, you got to either put on weight or you got to get faster to play the wide receiver position. I believed in Brandon Raymond. Was a former 4-star. Was after the commitment of West Virginia. Downgraded. That's what Rivals does. When West Virginia gets 4-star commits, they downgrade them to 3 stars. So liked what I saw out of his tape out of high school from St. Joe's Prep. Samaj Jones, his quarterback, you kind of thought that they were going to be a package deal in Morgantown. Instead, West Virginia gets Raymond. Jones passes on West Virginia to go to Cincinnati. So maybe they hook up there. That Raymond in the transfer portal visits Cincinnati, goes there. But was on a loaded number 1 team in the state of Pennsylvania out of high school. Just didn't think he got as many opportunities as some of the others on that high school staff. So thinking he would get a redshirt year. And maybe that's just one of those things, as if thinking Raymond is more of a project for 2026, 27, 28, and Rodriguez doesn't have necessarily that time right now at that wide receiver's position to afford him that time to grow. But really would have liked to see Brandon Raymond in a Mountaineer uniform. Also, Amir Leonard John Charles, another fringe 4-star recruit, I think on 247 Sports. He was a 4-star recruit for West Virginia. Comes in, had a really nice list of other schools that were competing for his services. He was a legacy. I don't know why he doesn't make it. If he doesn't have a physicality, the school that he played for down in Tennessee, a Christian school, looked up the schedule, and it just didn't seem like they were all that good. So I don't know if that plays any sort of an impact on his abilities, but right now, for whatever reason, maybe he was one of those players you would have liked to keep if you weren't cutting down to 105, but was one of the last cuts. And then also, 2 at the outside linebacker position, Ovina Onwuka was really one of the heralded recruits of the 2024 class. Also, Ramondo Johnson out of the 2025 class, really liked his tape. 6'4", 240, good size, good speed combination out of the state of Florida, where players grow on trees out there. So for them both not to make the roster, I'm just very curious at this. Why does Rodriguez believe in these JUCO recruits like a Marshawn Oxley, a Keenan Echt, Adam Tomzik, believing in them based upon what you've seen already out of spring practice, and really not having seen them in a Mountaineer uniform? So I don't know if this is, I'll hold my thoughts there. Also, really sad again about Jacoby Spells. Really thought after that Virginia Tech interception in 2023 that or was it 2022, that the sights were really going to soar for Jacoby Spells. But when he just didn't mature, now he's in his last year of eligibility. West Virginia has recruited over him with a whole bunch of guys, from other schools out of the transfer portal. I understand it if he wants to go use that year of eligibility, but just a damn shame. I almost feel worse about guys who are 4-star recruits or better, but West Virginia hasn't had a 5-star recruit since Noel Devine, not panning out at West Virginia, as I am seeing 2s and 3s play above their potential. It's just sad when that doesn't happen. So Jacoby Spells, sorry it didn't work out. So what I have to say about this overall, because West Virginia made social media national news there for a day when the transfer portal opened about how many players were hitting the portal, and oh my goodness, the sky is falling, all these players are leaving outside of West Virginia. But I just went through the names. About half of them weren't previously scholarship guys, so or were incoming high school, like just starting into college. So what I would really have to say, and this is where I'm a little bit heated, so I got to watch what I have to say. But this was Rich Rodriguez taking, and not directed at Rodriguez, taking a chainsaw to the last of what he could to the Neil Brown Trust the Climb administration. And I am just now absolutely very disappointed as a fan in Brown, because we've now been able to verify what we've analyzed for a long time. Number one, Brown and staff were average at best in terms of talent identification. You see, what was the first thing that Rodriguez did when he came in? Pretty much fired the entire recruiting staff. your high school and your GM, your GM for the transfer portal recruiting just did not believe in this staff's, the previous staffs, in terms of talent identification. Couldn't do so in his in his early years. I felt like the first couple of recruiting classes, Neil Brown and staff were targeting players that they were going to bring into Troy and reestablishing those recruiting relationships to bring up to West Virginia. And it didn't work for a lot of, and then finally I feel like hit his stride a little bit once he got out of the pandemic. That 2022 recruiting class, which guys would be now seniors, CJ Donaldson's senior season, had some hits, I felt like, during this year, but not enough, compounded with what was lost through the transfer portal and what West Virginia was failing to end up adding to the staff, mired in those years of 2020 through 2019 pretty much through 2022, where West Virginia was just so average, compounding that with NIL, but I'll talk about that in a second. So talent identity, and then just the recruiting relationships that Neil Brown had were just all Sunbelt relationships. Now, I felt like he was, and the staff were starting to build those there in the later years, and if 2024 would have went better, then, the strides that he made with Ironton in the border town high school on the border of Ohio and Kentucky, and some recruiting, that's Reed Carrico's former high school, that he, the relationships built there. I already talked about good counsel when talking about Gavin Crawford. Didn't make his mark in the WPIAL. It just never seemed like there was, and there was such a, either disregard. I don't think it was necessarily laziness or anything, but it was, we're going to rest on our laurels of these summer camps that we're going to bring to Morgantown and try and build our recruiting classes solely out of that, rather than going and identifying some secondary and tertiary recruiting markets, in addition to shoring up your own backyard. Again, drying up in southwestern Pennsylvania, only had a few pockets, I felt like, in the DMV and Ohio. Yes, the state of West Virginia, but I feel like he over-relied in some respects, and you're seeing that in guys like Judah Price, who was formerly a walk-on, but Azad Jackson, who you brought in, who I think was one of. So if I understand the argument that people were making from the transition of the Dana Holgerson era to the Neil Brown era, that there were some studs from the state of West Virginia, that it was appreciative that Neil Brown put the attention to recruiting those guys. But then it just seemed like, oh, well, we're going to roll. I'm really worried about Tyshawn Dews, for example, if he's going to be able to make this roster based upon, some of the cuts that have already been made. So if there were just guys that you're trying to rely on to fill roster positions who weren't D1 caliber players to begin with, why are you wasting your time in recruiting them? Well, then maybe, his argument might be, well, that's all we can get. So that's not good enough to me in compounding of what else. So the staff at best average, from the talent identification to the entire strategy across their primary recruiting grounds, secondary, tertiary, expanding and finding new ones, and then getting those places to commit. I do feel like some momentum was growing there, from that 2023 season to 2024. But my goodness, it took so long to get to that point. And then again, you weren't doing enough, I feel like, to bolster your transfer portal recruiting. That was the failure of the 2024 season, was you put so much effort into retention, and then you did not add enough in the transfer portal, compounding with average classes in the 40s nationally for high school, and so many of those players just did not pan out. Especially when you're talking about average at best player development. Another year, and this is timely to say this, of just one player being drafted in the NFL draft, bringing Neil Brown's grand total of 6 in 6 seasons. And I'm hard to even give him credit for Kenny Robinson in 2019, given that he didn't go to bat for him and Marcus Sims in the great cheating, academic scandal of that offseason, that we never got to see Robinson and Marcus Sims for their senior years. I'm sure that would have flown under previous head coaches, but going with the administration and letting those two players walk. So 5 really that Neil Brown and staff from 2019 through 2024 put into the NFL draft. When you look at the numbers of Dana Holgorsen, and this might just be an anomaly because of what as many that Don Nehlen, Rich Rodriguez, and Bill Stewart put in, but 25 draftees in 8 seasons compared to Neil Brown's 6 in 6 seasons. That's not good enough. You weren't identifying the right players, Power 4 level players. You aren't, and recruiting the right ones and the strategy all behind what their entire recruiting strategy was. Then when they got there, developing them over their case and point in time, and then putting them into the National Football League. So whether you want to make the argument whether Neil Brown was actually a good coach, or he was just held back by NIL resources, or he was just a really good guy, and he fooled the administration for so long there just on his, family man attitude. And I don't want this to be a referendum already more than it already has, but it's got me really disappointed because as fans, we invest time, resources, money, emotion, everything into being a fan and trusting that the coaches, know what they're doing. They're working their tails off. That was always some of the first excuses you heard about Neil Brown of like, oh, I got to find time to give enough off time in the summer for these assistant coaches to go, be with their families because of how much time that they commit to their job. Yes, I understand that. But that is what is the responsibility of a Division I college football coach, especially at the Power 4 level. Your effort has to be 60% or more into recruiting, and then you add in all the retention efforts and stuff like that. And there was just never a foundation, the Trust the Climb foundation, that there was buy-in from 2029, 2021, that you could see progression, that you could see guys that were really bought in. It just seemed like it was going through the motions, insanity, and never a diversified strategy to the point that during this point in season, I think during the middle of the year, that Neil Brown gave up. And you've now seen this recruiting class completely fall apart. And so many of the players who were previously on this roster, who transferred out during the winter portal window, who just never had that buy-in beyond the NIL dollars that were being invested in them. That's what kills me. That's what really grinds my gears and gets me mad, and why I say sayonara, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Because we as fans trusted in him to be this leader of the program that was not beyond what that good guy impression that so many people had in him. Because there were there were some really loyal heads. Zach Frazier, Wyatt Milam, Garrett Green, still Nico Marchiol. But then there were so many players, Tyke Smith, Akeem Mesidor, now Hudson Clement. God, and I know this is unfortunately where West Virginia finds itself in the kind of middle class of college. You're not in the SEC or Big Ten, so you're not making those dollars, and you're not in the G6. You're in that middle class of college football programs who are just getting shredded at both sides. But I just felt like there wasn't this kind of buy-in into the culture, into the program, into the development, and now the proof is in the pudding through all of it. So that's what I'm saying is Rich Rodriguez now is cleaning house, taking names, and now this is where, I hate to say it, but I feel like West Virginia can pick up off where Will Grier, David Sills graduated, moved on, went to the NFL draft, and it's like we're ending 2018. So, right now West Virginia has the 12th transfer portal class in all of college football. I seriously think that that's just because of quantity, not necessarily as much quality with 42 commits. And I was really, really nervous with the way that things, how slow things were moving as of about a week ago. And it really seemed like it took off in the last week. And that's why I wanted to focus more so on basketball, what's happening with them, because a lot of movement had happened in the prior weeks. Now it seems like this last week we've started to see some commitments roll in, and now it's crazy how 24 hours really can change so much of the conversation and so much of the dynamic that now I feel like I can better evaluate where this roster is post-spring season, what's looking forward, and we can talk about 2025, at a glimpse, at a 40,000 point view, because a lot of this roster, it seems like, is already set. So, even with having Coach Rod, who I've said on many videos, I feel like having the expectations of him being a miracle worker, that fans might have that, and I think he's done it before, so I have full faith in him that he is going to be able to, and this is going to be this mantra for this entire season. How can he maximize on the potential of the players on the roster? Can he take gems that are diamonds in the rough and polish them up and play them and have them produce at the level that they best can? Because that's what we didn't get out of the Neil Brown players. So many across the board. But to expect him to, take this team to a Big 12 championship winning season, at least here at the end of April, I'm saying seems kind of out of possibility, I feel like. But there's going to be a lot still to talk about, and I feel really, good in a sense. So we'll wrap that up. I don't want to get too high on myself. But still, even with that, the transfer portal, until bigger things happen in the sport of college football, college athletics as a whole, conference realignment, house settlement, revenue sharing, as all that settles, West Virginia is still best going to have to rely on Power 2, and I'm calling it now the Power 2 in the Big Ten and the SEC, cast-offs and high-quality G6 or FCS guys. That is the sweet spot for transfer portal recruiting for West Virginia, in addition with retention, and they got to get more, got to make some waves, I feel like, in the high school recruiting for 2026, 2027. We'll talk about 2026 recruiting as we get closer to summer, as those summer, visits start to roll in and we start to see more commitments roll in. I think they have like 7 as of right now. So until it can get things rolling again, West Virginia as a program, I'm talking about winning games, rivalry games, contending for conference championships, putting guys in the NFL, and you have this overarching cloud of what it's going to cost with revenue sharing, the NIL component with the new NCAA, Deloitte transfer clearinghouse, NIL clearinghouse. They're going to be continuously competing against those SEC Big Ten schools for top talent. That's where it's so difficult. I don't care who the coach is, whether it's Rich Rodriguez, anybody else. But the effort that's going in, these last few weeks, I feel like, to add at certain positions, bravo. I really think has really rounded out well. And let's talk about it. So let's go kind of position group offensively, then we'll transition to defensively, and I'll give you some of my thoughts. So big swing today. Commitment came earlier this morning, adding Jalen Knighton, SMU's running back of 2 seasons ago, starter, guy who was on all conference lists and then got hurt early on in the season for SMU, hits the portal, has 1 year of eligibility, so he's a 5th-year guy, good size, strength combination. I think he will really complement Jaheim White's abilities well. And I said this, I felt like all off season, and gotta manage Jaheim White's carries. More effective, I feel like, in spurts of use of explosiveness, running out to the outside instead of beating him between the tackles. It just seemed like so many play calls mistakenly made by Neil Brown this past season of using Jaheim White north and south rather than C.J. Donaldson, and C.J. Donaldson east and west instead of Jaheim White. Just madness. So if the play calls, now granted, I think this is finally the year that Jaheim White's going to have to show that he can take somewhere in the ballpark of 18 to 22 carries per game. That's a lot. So that's a lot on his workload. But if he can do so, Jalen Knighton can come in and spell him, maybe take 8 to 12 carries per game. That's going to be a lot. But I think he is the number 2 running back that you desperately needed for this team. Because I don't know necessarily so much about Ty Edwards on how much you're going to use him outside of short yardage situations. I don't think this is why I was so high on CJ Donaldson, and that's why I was so sad whenever he left in the offseason, is guys like CJ Donaldson just don't grow on trees. That size speed combination, the ability to just run through people, run over them. So I kind of am in a wait and see mode on Ty Edwards, having not seen him, because I've seen lots of guys who have that, size, but then just don't have the speed to complement it. And it's a faster game coming from Northern Iowa to the big leagues in the Big 12. So if he's just used in short yardage situations, goal line situations, great, perfect, fine, that's okay. But when's the last 2 plus 240 running back that you can remember? And I, had to go in the history books, in Rich Rodriguez's system, that was of that size. You want your speed, guys. That's what he's going to want on the field. He's going to want his Noel Devines, wants his Steve Slaytons, wants his KJ Harris's, Quincy Wilson. So that's probably it. But I don't even think Quincy Wilson was that big. Avon Coburn, I think, was 220. So we'll have to see, but really love that addition. Really think rounded out this transfer class really well. Tight end, again, blew up the tight end room. 3-4 guys now are gone, so expect Jacob Barrick to be your starter. I'll go through kind of a 2 deep here to round out the show. Don't understand this addition in Grayson Barnes. Happy to have him, but I've been waiting. I waited through the Rich Rodriguez into Bill Stewart era, until Tyler Urban came along. There was really an underutilized tight ends. So to add Grayson Barnes when you already have a Greg Genros, what's the point of having both when you throw very few passes to tight ends already? So is his blocking better out of Northern Illinois? Is his blocking better, or I don't know. I don't know what to expect yet out of this tight end room. So I don't want to make any crazy claims. At the wide receiver position, video I made just like a week and a half, 2 weeks ago about adding. I would be wary of adding in the wide receiver room because I already feel as if West Virginia, you only need 2 wide receivers in Rich Rodriguez's system. You can look through the stats, Jacksonville State and his West Virginia years, Michigan, Arizona State, Arizona. You don't need so now they've added, of course. They don't do what I said. What are the prospects for Jaden Bray, Rodney Gallagher? I don't know. They've added 2 really good, I feel like, wide receivers, and Christian Hamilton, a guy who was really underutilized at North Carolina, a guy who coming out of high school had a higher recruiting 4-star grade than Traylon Ray. So if this is a Traylon Ray replacement, fantastic. If he can produce at the same level as Traylon Ray or more. And then Justin Smith-Brown out of South Carolina State, put up big numbers, over 50 catches. Can he be a complement of number 2 opposite Cam Vaughn at the 1? What does that mean for Bray? What does that mean for Jeff Weimer, who's yet to practice for this team? Again, what's Preston Fox's role? Very curious to see what happens with this wide receiver room. And then today, another commitment alongside Jalen Knighton, Jordan McCants, former Jacksonville State wide receiver under Rodriguez. So if he just felt like that wide receiver room wasn't complete with 11, you had to get 12. If you're only going to play 2, got 6 different quarterbacks on this roster. Got to get them involved in practice. I don't know. Maybe we're looking at a diversified offense. I'll talk about that later, in the spring and in the summer, kind of analyzing what I think we should expect out of this West Virginia offense for this upcoming fall. But that can come later. I want to just talk about the roster management for tonight. So adding 3 wide receivers to already a crowded room. Here's where I think the investment was great. This was awesome. So thankful. If this is Ken Kendrick's money, Pat McAfee's money going to pay these players. Mikel Clay, North Alabama. Looked up. North Alabama was terrible this past season. I think they only had 2 wins. So, but you watch some of the tape on him, and man, this dude can hit. So, he's not going to hold back from a fight. Also adding Malik Agbo, who was a former 4-star, top 250 recruit in the nation 3 recruiting classes ago, according to Rivals, out of the state of Washington, goes to Texas, is a guy who redshirts but also kind of plays like a hybrid tight end at 6'4", 300. So it must be a really athletic kid. Bring him in alongside another transfer from a former Big 12 school, Josh Isosa, former in-state kid in Oklahoma. Just think like trying to work his way onto the roster, and I'm sure looked at the depth chart after the spring portal season opened. Not really going to see the field this year for Oklahoma, so let's go and test it out at West Virginia. I'll talk about that in just a second when I break down the 2 deep, but really 3 tackle prospects to come in and compete with what West Virginia has. Love those additions. Another one I really loved, defensive end, kind of a tweener, Eddie Kelly Jr. out of Missouri. Kind of looks to be too big, not fast enough to play defensive or outside linebacker, but maybe just a little bit undersized, kind of like a 5 technique to play if you've been watching the NFL draft and learned something about there. So if Zach Alley decides to go to a 4-3 front, and I think Kelly makes total sense there at the defensive end position on the opposite side of Jamori Robinson. If he's going to be, if it's a 3-man front, can he play defensive end or, stand him up to play outside linebacker, or does he compete with Eddie Vestorinen on that defensive line? So very curious to see how he's used, but like some of the raw physical tools that I've seen on Eddie Kelly Jr. Also, going to be, I don't want to say this, underrated or something like this, but a guy who was like an FCS honorable mention All-American, Ben Bogle, outside linebacker, only 6'2", 225. So, do you put him in there at middle, or is he an outside edge rusher? I think to be determined on that, but I like what he was able to do rushing the passer, again, at the FCS level. Add him to that linebacker room. Good to have another body in there competing. Cornerback, didn't think West Virginia needed a guy who was in his final year of eligibility. You kind of understand where that 2 deep is, and not seeing any roster movement out among those defensive backs was very interesting to see. When Rich Rodriguez was pretty much saying, like, we got to get some more, corners in one of his spring season press conferences. So to go get Nick Taylor from App State, one of the coaches. So Rod West, cornerbacks coach, incoming for this season, previously from App State, already brought on Jason Chambers, already over from App State, who's in his last year of eligibility. Maybe Nick Taylor was a guy he saw some things in, really liked. I was listening to a really good podcast a couple of weeks ago by the 247 Sports guys and Mike Kazaza and Chris Anderson, talking about how Nick Taylor really started to get snaps increase at the end of App State's season a year ago. So maybe he's a guy who can come in there, really compete hard in practice this whole season to then be a contender for a starting position in 2026. You don't have to hit the transfer portal that hard for the 4th consecutive offseason. I'm so sick of West Virginia having to go out there and get like 10 new cornerbacks. So happy to have Nick Taylor. And then I always love, if you follow my programs and my pregame shows weekly during the season, I always talk about special teams, because special teams, when games are so close in the Big 12, and we always know how they go down to the wire, special teams can make or break games. So I knew Michael Hayes was going to run out of eligibility, and it was like, who's West Virginia's kicker going to be? Then they get Ethan Head out of Tulane, and all of the press conferences, Coach Rodriguez is just saying, he's just a kickoff specialist. the hell? So who's your place kicker then? So they go out there, get a guy in Cade Hensley from Coastal Carolina, 16 for 19 this past year, had a long of 49. So, being a casual fan of Coastal Carolina for all the times that I travel down to Myrtle Beach, wow, awesome. Happy to have him. Hope he goes out there, makes a whole bunch of kicks for the Mountaineers this year. Going to be happy to have him. So I have already started to draw up a two deep. So if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for sticking around this long. I think this is really ultimately what you wanted to hear. So I'll just say this for right now. I feel like come Big 12 Media Day, and whenever you finally get your copy of whatever college football preview magazine that you like to peruse over the summer, like myself, I'm a Lindy's guy, you're going to see more oars, I feel like, than a crew match or, a rowing race, whatever you want to call it that. There are so many oars, I feel like, that are still going to be be determined in August camp that I can't make a calls, but I'll kind of talk through each one. So offensively, defensively, I'm able to kind of piece together what I feel like is a two deep or some of these competitions. So starting it off at the quarterback position, we know it's going to go down to Nico Marchiol and Jalen Henderson. Henderson only having one more year's worth of eligibility, has a little bit better speed, it seems like, than Nico Marchiol. But Marchiol's a guy who's been loyal, fought within this system, wins games. Most importantly, wins games. When he gets the opportunity, he wins. It's not always pretty. Evidenced by that Cincinnati game this past season, but man, he's had some good ones. So I want a winner. That is Nico Marchiol. So it's going to come down to who fits the system better and who's going to win games ultimately. And I feel like who complements this run game, because we're going to see a lot of run. Over 50% probably. So it's going to be Marchiol, Henderson, probably a guy like Max Brown to hold down the third position. Scotty Fox, Khalil Wilkins will fight it out, really, who gets that fourth. At the running back position, I like the two-headed monster. I'm not going to call one versus the other in the two deep. Jaheim White, Jalen Knighton, going to be your two-headed monster. Short yardage situation, I feel like Ty Edwards. Dior Hubbard came on strong in spring practice in the spring game. He's going to be your injury insurance policy with when Knighton, Edwards graduate on next season. I think Dior Hubbard can complement a senior Jaheim White there at that running back position if you're already looking ahead to 2026. At your wide receivers, I think it is totally up for grabs. The only one I feel pretty confident about is Cam Vaughn. Cam Vaughn being wide receiver number 1. If it's now Justin Smith-Brown from South Carolina State, who's your wide receiver 2. I can see a competition going between Jaden Bray, Christian Hamilton, Jarrell Williams, or Jeff Weimer for one of those other, wide receiver starting positions. And then in the slot, I feel like it's still a battle between Rodney Gallagher or Preston Fox or Oran Singleton Jr. Because again, last time Rodriguez saw Oran Singleton against him in a game setting, he beat up Jacksonville State for 8 catches for 89 yards. There's obviously a belief there. We'll have to just see. And Preston Fox has been beating out Rodney Gallagher for how many seasons now, especially in the returning department. So the best, I feel like 4 are going to win out, with 2 seeing most of the receptions. But we'll see how the offense develops. Tight end, I feel like I've talked about this enough. Going to be Jacob Barrett, and I feel like predominantly at tight end, Jacob Barrett, and then either at the pass catching tight end, Grayson Barnes or Greg Genross. Have yet to see anything from him. So let's move on to the offensive line. This is where it's also a complete crapshoot, because West Virginia is shooting at the hip. Replacing all of its, the entire offensive starting line. So the one guy I feel most confident about is Walter Young-Bear. Looking at his tape from Tulsa, mauler, rush in the rush department. Walter Young-Bear, I'm penciling him at left guard. And then at right guard, I really felt like he was primed for a starting position anyway for this upcoming season with Jaquay Hubbard graduating, was Nick Cray. So felt really confident about them. But then Kimo Makanole from LSU coming back over. Thought maybe perhaps he had a chance at tackle, but what West Virginia was able to do at tackle and adding Isosa, Clay, and Agbo, I think Makanole is going to be the third kind of rotational guard. So he's going to compete against Young Bear. He's going to compete against Cray for one of those starting positions. So I could see either one of those, any combination of the two of those three, with the third guy being the rotational guard, with kind of Cooper Young and Wyatt Minor looking behind them for the future. So then at the tackles, I feel like it's going to be a battle between 5 guys for 2 positions. So if you're just going by who was on the team for spring practice, Tykeist Crawford at left tackle and Xavier Bosley at right tackle, who you thought had Nick Malone not had an awesome senior season in his final year in Morgantown, would have, after having over 800 snaps in 2023 for Jacksonville State, he would snag that right tackle position. So if I'm penciling in Bosley at right tackle and Crawford at left tackle, so then it's going to be a battle between those 2 guys, as I mentioned, with Isosa, Clay, and Agbo. Who's going to win out there? To be determined. I'm not going to make that call here in April, but I can at least give you the scope there. So that's the offense. Marchiol, White, Vaughn, and a whole bunch of cast of characters still to be determined. Barrick at tight end, and a line completely still to be determined. Who's going to ever gel there? On the defensive side of the ball, this is where I think it can get a little specialized. Again, do not know how much Zach Alley is going to want to go to a 4-man front, with 2 linebackers and 5 in the secondary, a 4-2-5 or a 3-4. It sounds like they can be completely multiple, but for sake of just saying, with, let's say it's a 3-3-5, Jamori Robinson being on one side of defensive end, and I really do think it's going to be a battle between Eddie Kelly Jr., Asani Redwood, and Edward Vestorinen, who's coming off a season-ending injury in week 2 last year, to compete at that defensive tackle position, with at the nose Hammond Russell, Corey McIntyre, and Nate Gabriel. If there's one position I feel like for the rest of the spring and into early summer that West Virginia could potentially add in the spring or in the transfer portal, would be defensive line. But there's a guy I feel like from the high school ranks, I talked about him way back in December on National Signing Day, who I was really high on watching the tape. I was just like, whoa, what? Is Taylor Brown, this kid out of Maryland. Again, kind of a tweener, so he might be a 3 technique. Some sites have him at 6'4", 250. Others have him at 6'3", 260. So I don't know necessarily what he weighs, but either way, that's a little bit small to be a nose tackle when you're talking about Russell 300, McIntyre 300, Gabriel 300. So if you have a 4-man front, again, we got to see what he's able to compete. But that is a name I would definitely watch over the summer, and it's one I'm going to be watching, is can he make some noise? Because he is a really, really solid pass rusher in between the A-gap. So both sides of the center, getting in between, rushing from the interior, might be a guy who might surprise. So that's a name to watch. So then at linebacker, I think you feel good about 4 guys, kind of in there, and Chase Wilson against Ben Cutter, I would say at one position, with Reed Carrico, I think will start at an inside linebacker position, Ashton Woods backing him up, with Caden Beiser, Ricky Williams kind of as your third strings there. Could West Virginia add another linebacker there in the middle, compete with all of those guys already mentioned? Yes, I think you have another roster position to use. Might have some more summer cuts come in August. So want to see there. At Bandit, I have no idea what West Virginia is doing, but considering, You got Braden Siders, Ben Bogle now from Southern Illinois, Marshawn Oxley, who's a JUCO product, Keenan Eck, who's a JUCO product, and Curtis Jones, who's one of the few remaining guys I feel like coming from the 2024 freshman class, but got enough playing time to now be considered a sophomore, kept on the roster. Obviously, the staff sees something in him. Maybe it's his athleticism. He's gotten a little bit bigger, too, from what he was listed a season ago. So, to be determined, I feel like, with what happens at that bandit position. That's why I feel a little bit more confident in those inside linebackers than that bandit position. So, if West Virginia wants to go to a 4-2-5, plus I've been calling for that for, I feel like, 20 years. So, I'd love to see a freaking four-man front. Then in the secondary, if Kokora Tarnu is one of your safeties, Jordan Walker one of your safeties, Fred Perry looked awesome apparently from by all reports of people who were at the spring game, still pissed off that game wasn't streamed on ESPN+. Michael Coates locking down one side with maybe a Derek Carter on the other side because he was a starter for Jacksonville State this past year. So that leaves, I think, a William Davis competing with a Jacob Boyce for one of the starting positions, with a Justin Harrington maybe competing with Walker for another. And then if Perry's locking down the nickel safety, what's going on with Jordan Scruggs, who's got 1 year worth of eligibility, and then Zay Jennings, who people loved coming out of the 2024 spring game. So those are your kind of like 6-7 safeties. That's 8. I feel like to compete for 3 starting positions, and then at corner, it's a longer list than that. Jason Chambers, Devontae Golden Nelson at corner. Also, some holdovers from last year of previous walk-on and Jaden Bell, Keyshawn Robinson, former in-state guy, who's now a sophomore, Nick Taylor, and then who was at one time a 4-star recruit who's still a part of the summer, fall 25 high school players in Dwayne Galloway. So really curious to see how he competes over the summer camp. And then on special teams, feeling confident about now Cade Hensley being your place kicker, Ethan Head being your kickoff specialist, if you want to call that, or backup to Hensley, Ollie Straw doing the punting duties. I'll say coin flip to go to the older guy, McQuire Moss at the long snapper, and Preston Fox doing your kickoff and punt return duties. But again, might split that, maybe put him on punt return, add some other guys, or keep him at the kickoff return, but add another. Depends upon how they want to line that up. So ultimately, walk through the 2 deep. Love to know your thoughts. What are you penciling in so far? Let's get to it. Final question. 52 minutes in here, going like crazy. Let's answer the question. How good, on paper, will WVU be this fall? Or if you don't even want to say on paper. But I'll say on paper for analysis, because we still have a lot to go between whenever this season kicks off, 4 months from now, summer workouts, new players getting added. Unfortunately, West Virginia lost the offensive line commit in Will Reed. We hardly knew he. Forgot to mention him earlier from Princeton. So a lot of hard edge competition will happen on Law School Hill and elsewhere over the summer, and then a grueling summer camp where more, I feel like, of the offensive system install, defensive system install will have to happen and will happen. Because the coaches will get a little more settled in, a lot of evaluating that happened during this spring season to see who could play and who couldn't play. So now you kind of have, I feel like, at least a rough idea of your 2 deep across for competing purposes. So I will say right now, here at April, if I have to get an answer, the way that I've already started to analyze some other rosters across the Big 12, I feel like West Virginia is somewhere in the ballpark of the 7th to 8th best roster in the Big 12 this upcoming fall. And that's if everything comes together. And that is for my money, the offensive line, first and foremost, gelling so that we have the kind of run game that West Virginia fans are accustomed to from 20 years ago with Pat White and Steve Slayton. Now, no matter how much I love Nico Marchiol, will not be Pat White. They're not the same player. Neither is Jalen Henderson. Henderson is closer to what Marchiol is, I feel like, than what Pat White is. So we're not going to see that kind of an offense, at least this upcoming fall. But we can still see fireworks from that quarterback position. Feel really confident about this running back group if and only if this offensive line gels. And now there's enough competition at the wide receiver position to figure it out. Then defensively, oh man, I just think like the front is still a work in progress about how you can rush the passer, how you can be so physical. But I just think it's so interestingly quiet that no changes were made to that defensive secondary. So you're going with what you have, feeling confident about it, but there's a lot of additions from the lower ranks in lower ranks in the G6, FCS, who are now going to be put at Big 12 starting caliber positions. So are these guys ready for it? Well, only to be determined. Will we see closer to 2022 with McCormick and Ajayi at cornerback, or will we see more Beanie Bishop and Malachi Ruffin of what we saw in 2023? Is it like a odd year that you get your good years, then your even years or your bad? To be determined. But I think right now, looking at teams like BYU, Texas Tech, Arizona State, Kansas State, Iowa State, and TCU, I feel really good at where they are from a roster standpoint. And West Virginia, trying to, on paper, match up with those guys. I think West Virginia is right there with the likes of, say, Baylor, Colorado, Utah, Kansas. That's where the coin flips are going to come, because I looked, this was back in February, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going through my notes here. This was back on, come on, Carson, find it. The ESPN SP Plus rankings. So this was late February. This is what ESPN produced. Considered returning production, recent recruiting, recent history. West Virginia, unfortunately, was ranked 64th. 64th in those SP Plus rankings. Teams that were ahead of West Virginia in those rankings that are on their schedule for this upcoming fall: TCU at 26th, BYU at 27th, Arizona State 29th, Utah 32nd, 33rd Texas Tech, 48th Colorado, 49th Kansas, Pitt 53rd, UCF 56th. West Virginia coming in at 64th. Now we know West Virginia is not going to go 3-9. No way. Ain't going to happen. They're not just going to beat Robert Morris, Ohio, and Houston. They're going to do better than that. But I don't want to go with any sort of speculation, or predictions already for the fall and wins and losses and stuff like that. But did West Virginia become so much marginally better that they're now better than a team like Texas Tech, who spent $15 million in transfer portal recruiting allegedly this past offseason, the returning Big 12 champions in Arizona State, or the team that was arguably more deserving to be in the college football playoff in BYU? Or what about a Utah who really was probably pissed off about finishing as poorly as they did because of their offense this past season? TCU was an 8-9 win team quietly. So that's what I'm saying is I don't think that West Virginia can go back to there's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough to go out there and completely overhaul this team to the point that there's not enough good players out in the transfer portal right now that you're going out there and you're going to improve a letter grade or better. What it's going to fall on now is this coaching staff. Is Coach Rodriguez and staff, and maximizing these players' potential to play up to the best of their ability, in gelling together as an offense and a defense, when to me right now this still is just a collection of players. This isn't a team. That they don't know each other. The most transfer portal additions of any program in FBS, West Virginia. They have to know, and sometimes I feel like that can be a bit overrated because we saw how good the basketball team was this past season. They completely flipped the roster, and we'll see this upcoming year how good the basketball team, and they're completely flipping the roster. So in today's world of the transfer portal, it's bound to happen. But it took still 2 years for Colorado in flipping its roster to get to a point where they're still just an 8-win team from a season ago. So having this grandiose expectations that in a year when Texas Tech is going for it, West Virginia is going to go out there and win the Big 12, I think we have to temper some expectations. So that's kind of where I'm sitting, at least right now. You might see here a change of tune from me as I look into these players a little bit more, look into the system from Jacksonville State, and I'll talk about that as we go, again, in spring and in summer, and how good I feel like this team can be with the schedule that they have. And again, on paper right now, at least early on, there's some possibility for West Virginia to pad its win-loss. But, hard to make those calls as of right now, April 28th. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. Love to know your thoughts. Has West Virginia done enough in the transfer portal? Were you sad to see some of the players go? Do you agree with me on what I had to say about the cuts that needed to be made? Or the players that West Virginia didn't necessarily retain, the players that it was able to go out there and go get in the transfer portal? Are you happy with that in comparison to previous years of the kind of quality and quantity that West Virginia has been able to bring in? And their prospects for the future, and where this roster sits right now with its too deep and in competition with the others in the conference. And we haven't even talked about how they stack up against Pitt. So love to know your thoughts. If you like this video, please like it so more Mountaineer fans can see it across YouTube and chime in. I'm so thankful, really, really thankful to all of you. I now hit over 500 subscribers for a channel, and coming up this upcoming August in 2 years. So for 500 people to care what some guy here has to say and the crazy thoughts that come from my mind, I really appreciate you all subscribing. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your dog that I do this each and every week and have a lot of fun doing it. So I'd love to have more subscribers as we gear up for this 2025 season. Gonna bounce back to baseball, I feel like, after this video, because we're hitting the home stretch, final month of the regular season, and we have a team that's trying to win a Big 12 outright season championship, maybe a tournament championship, host a regional, at least get to a national regional. What a baseball, this baseball season is one for, I feel like, the record books, even though it's maybe not necessarily the highest quality of regular season wins. In quantity, they're shooting for a record. So we're going to transition back to baseball. I'll keep my eye on football. If any huge news breaks, I'll be sure to bring it to you. So thanks for tuning in. Hail West Virginia. Let's go spot the ball.